Wonderful. Thank you, Gavin, and good afternoon, good day to everyone joining us today for the ANSI IICRC S540 2023 standard overview of the revision that we have just recently published as part of this is part of the IICRC Certified Firms webinar series. And we're going to do an overview of the standard. I will introduce our speakers momentarily. First, to start off with, my name is Millie Washington, and I am IICRC's Standards Director. I've been with IICRC for almost 13 years now, and I'm proud to say that we have grown our standards division greatly over the last decade or so, and look forward to many more changes and new standards being published very soon. So in that vein, I'd like to just provide a very quick update before we jump into the S540 on some of the things that we have been up to recently in terms of standards development. Of course, the S540, which is the standard of today's topic, is the standard for trauma and crime scene cleanup. We recently published the second edition of the standard in 2023. And in addition to the 540 second edition, we also published a brand new HVAC assessment standard, the ANSI IICRC S590. The first edition was published in late 2023. And then lastly, the S800, ANSI IICRC S800 standard for professional inspection of textile floor covering. This standard was published back in 2014, or almost a decade ago. So the second edition was just published in 2023. And we're happy to say that, it is now current and updated and available to everyone who would like to purchase or review the standard. So those are three of the standards that we recently published. I also want to touch on some of the things that are coming up very soon. First of which is the S520 mold remediation standard. We have completed the process with multiple rounds of public review and hundreds of public review comments. And we're getting ready to publish the 2024 edition of the standard. My best guess for that is the end of May of this year. Also coming up are two new fire standards, the Professional Fire and Smoke Damage Restoration Standard, S700. We are currently finishing out the third limited public review for this standard, and we expect and hope to be able to publish this groundbreaking new fire standard this summer. And then lastly, the S760, which is the Wildfire Investigation and Restoration of Impacts to Structures, Systems, and Content Standard. We are currently in the second full public review of the standard, and if all goes well, we intend to publish it by the end of 2024. So lots of good things coming your way. Please keep an eye on this space and new standards coming from IICRC. Also, just a little bit touching on all of our standards. I'm not going to go into this, but I just kind of wanted to have that on your screens so you can just take a look and see all the different standards that are currently in development or in revision. Many of these are brand new standards that we're working on putting together with individual consensus bodies, and they will be coming your way for public review very soon. And so the request is if any of these are areas of interest to you, to please review and comment during the public review period. We rely on industry stakeholders to do so that our standards can be improved and really incorporate all of the feedback from different industry representatives. And that's it. That's everything from me. And with that, I would like to introduce our co-speakers for today's webinar, David Oakes and Dr. Gavin McGregor Skinner. I just want to give you just a very brief bio for each of our speakers before they jump in and start with the meat of the webinar. David Oakes started in the cleaning and restoration business in 1973 with 43 years experience as owner and operator. He has held a general contractor's license and ASCS certification from NACA. David's current certifications include a triple master from the IICRC and certified restorer from RIA. As an IICRC approved instructor, David teaches CCT, WRT, AST, OCT, FSRT, and TCST certification classes. David has provided expert witness testimony in both state and federal court. He is currently the Vice Chair of Standards at IICRC and also the Chair of the S540 consensus body. Dr. Gavin McGregor Skinner is a Senior Director at ISSA, the Worldwide Cleaning Trade Association, and has more than 30 years of technical experience in responding to infectious disease outbreaks and emergency management. He has served on COVID-19 medical advisory committees for multiple large corporations. He currently manages the ISSA Making Safer Choices program and the Cleaning for Health program and is an associate professor at Penn State College of Medicine. And with that, gentlemen, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you, Millie. I would like to just quickly introduce the current consensus body members. Leslie Anderson is vice chair, Ann Bedwell, Mark Cornelius is an instructor as well as board member. By the way, Leslie is also a board member. And move on to the next slide. We've got Juan Herrera, and David Martineau and Benjamin Marks. And on the next slide, Scott McFasden. So we have two Scots on board, and Gordy Powell as well as Scott Vogel. I didn't really have time to give the background on each and every one of these people, but a tremendous amount of knowledge and experience in this industry, and couldn't have gotten this standard to this point without their help. And I have a special introduction too. We do have Scott Vogel on. We invited him to be a special guest on this panelist. He's going to bring some important information on some governmental regulations that are current and upcoming. So we look forward to this. So there will be the three of us speaking, myself and Dr. Gavin, as well as Scott Vogel, and you can address questions to any of or all of us at the end. So let's just look at the outline of what we're going to do today, Millie. This is just kind of the bullet points. We're going to talk a little bit about the history. We're going to give you scope and purpose, the legislative updates, which Scott is going to bring us up to speed on, some really important information on the changes to the standard, talk about contamination removal, the addition of porous type 1 and porous type 2 to structural materials, as well as structural restoration. Some comment on decomposition odor that seems to be a pretty misunderstood subject. And then post-remediation evaluation. An important point that I don't think any other standard has is demobilization, content cleaning, and then as we move on in our little outline here, quality control, some of the techniques. We'll talk about hydrogen peroxide, ultraviolet light, visual assessment, ATP, and environmental cultures. So a lot of good information here for you today. So what we'd like to do is, Millie, just talk a little bit about the standards process and then maybe a little bit about the history of this standard, the S540, if you would, Millie.
Absolutely. Thank you, David. Back to me. Just a little bit in terms of where we are and how we got here. The first edition, of course, of the S540 trauma and crime scene standard was published back in 2017. And as per ANSI requirements, we, as standards developers, have to revise and republish our standards on a regular cycle so as to ensure that the standard is current and up to date, which is why we recently published the S540 second edition at the end of 2023. Just a little bit of the background on that. We started the process with a PINS submission back in 2020, May of 2020. And the new consensus body that put together this standard had its introductory meeting in January of 2021. And that committee worked long and hard on this revision all the way from January 2021 till almost September 2023. The standard went through 2 rounds of public review, during which time the draft document was made available to pretty much anyone in the industry for review and comment. The first round of public review was held from January to March of 2023, and we received close to 200 public review comments. And of course, each of those comments had to be addressed individually and responded to. And the committee also made many changes based on those comments that we received. And as always, the public review process helps make our documents better, because that's how we get feedback from everyone who may be interested, because the consensus bodies are, of course, limited in number as well as, in some cases in expertise. And so we finished that first round of public review in March of 2023. The committee made changes to the standard, and then those changes were put out for a second round of public review from August to September of 2023, just so that, any stakeholders are aware of the changes that were made to the standard, any substantive changes, anything that changes the requirements of the standard in any way. And so that's what brought us to this point of having published the standard and this webinar today. And that just gives you a little bit of a overview of the process that we have followed. Of course, everything is done as per ANSI's essential requirements, and we have ANSI approval for this standard to have been published as an American national standard.
Just a point on this too is it's public review. It's not industry review, so anybody has access to this. And then just to make a point, the dedication of the consensus body members, we met once a week for that entire period for at least an hour, sometimes an hour and a half. So a tremendous amount of volunteer effort went into this. And off meeting nights, there was very often other subcommittee work done, and people working on the weekends and gathering information and data. So want to really congratulate the committee for their dedication to that. So let's look at, back to Scott, I'm going to turn this over to you at this point, because we need to talk about some licensing stuff here. And I'll let you take it away at this point.
Thank you, David. So right off the bat, let's talk about some federal guidelines that, especially in the United States, that many people don't know or they're unfamiliar with. So we have the 1910-1030 out of OSHA, which is the bloodborne pathogen standard. This is mandated by OSHA that we all have, each individual employee that's responding to a blood incident, have this type of training. We also, very common, which is we saw during COVID, is respiratory protection, which is 1910-134, which we'll post links into this webinar shortly. This is a law that OSHA has created that protects our respiratory protection that you must have. Now we also have 1910-132, which is personal protective equipment. And also one of the ones that is a recommend that we did recommend into our standard that we do recommend is the HAZWOPER, which is a hazardous waste operation and emergency response, which is 1910-120. That is a recommend in the standard. Now, regarding state regulations, now Georgia came out in 2019 that was signed into bill regulating companies that actually perform this service. California has been around since about 2005. That is the Waste and Trauma Act. Proposed bills is New Jersey Bill 2924. This is actually one of the first that actually regulates a company, as well as making sure and certifying that every technician is actually physically trained. So instead of just now having the company registered, we are now pushing that every certification, every person that goes onto a job is certified, as well as making sure they are trained. Now, the IICRC, the S540 training, we are putting that as one of the trainings that's recommended as well as approved in New Jersey. Now, there is a few other things that I do want to talk about this. The good thing about all three of these bills is they actually physically define what trauma and crime scene waste is. And this is, in many states, a very gray area when we get into our fields. As you can see on the slide, licenses for transportation, storage, and disposal. In certain states, the medical definition of what is regulatory medical waste is it says hospital, it says from laboratories. So it's undefined what kind of waste we actually have to. So this is why in the IICRC standard, we say check for your local, state, and federal regulations, because each state will define it differently. So this is why it's very important that we establish these laws to actually give us clear definition what trauma and crime scene waste is. Another thing that I want to mention is the pilot program. So in Philadelphia right now, a pilot program has been established. The pilot program actually allows crime scene cleanups to go out on the streets and clean up after murders, shootings, homicides, anything out in the street. They will be calling a company out to do this. Now, we're seeing these in bigger companies. New York City's looking into it. LA's looking into it. But Philadelphia is the first one to actually physically pull kind of the strings and said, we're going to create this pilot program. So look out, opportunities coming up, that pilot programs in bigger cities will be coming up to give companies the opportunity to bid on these, as well as Department of Health in multiple states are now coming up with recommendations. New York City Department of Health actually has something that actually recommends companies to be certified through the IICRC as well as the American Biorecovery Association. So make sure that you look at the Department of Health and these regulations coming forward, as well as what we're going forward on your transportation, storage, and disposal. Again, I want to alliterate, always check your state and local regulations regarding this, because it does differ from state to state. Until we can get regulations nationwide, we're still going to see this. Other than that, Dave, that's what I have to talk about when it comes to regulations.
Good. Thank you for that, Scott. And I do want to make a mention to the group here. Scott has been very active in the New Jersey area with the proposed legislation, as well as Cordy Powell was very instrumental in getting legislation in Georgia. And in both of these cases, these gentlemen are working for our industry and for the customer's best interest in reality. And some of this has to do with pricing and overcharging issues, but most of it really boils down to getting the job done properly. So let's move on, Millie. So I just put up here the scope. I'm not going to read this to you. I just want to put this up on the screen. So what you're going to see over the next series of slides here are quotes right out of the standard. In some cases, it's a paragraph or a couple paragraphs of that section. So here we just put out the scope of what this standard is to be, and what the basic part of it is. So we're looking at cleanup of the surface and item location. Move on to the next slide, and we'll look at the purpose, to define the methodology used by the technician. And one of the things that has changed in the standard, so I might make this note of the change. When we developed the first standard, and it was published 2017, there was no certified technician. So we did say technician, and we put a lot of responsibility on the technician. One of the things that we did in this standard was to very carefully identify responsibilities, particularly between the technician and the company and management. Obviously, the standard doesn't include everything, but it does work to provide the minimum. And when I say minimum is actually a fairly high standard. And when we look at standard of care, we'll look at shall and should, and what those terms mean, that they're very important. We go on the next slide, Millie. Okay, and then the principles, and this really is just the outline of the sections within the standard. And if you'll notice up here, the very first thing we talked about was safety and health. And Scott brought that up, how important it is that we have those safety and health programs in place before we even start to even consider to do trauma and crime scene cleanup. We look at all of the things on this list. Again, I'm not going to read this list to you. You've got it there so that you can see what's in the standard. And at this point, too, I just would talk about something about standards in general. It seems like our industry is really good at picking and choosing the parts we like and ignoring the other parts. We need to take the standard as a whole. And it doesn't matter what side of this equation you're on, whether you're the consumer, whether you're an insurance partner, or whether you're a provider, the standards have to be considered as that. So if we could move on to the next slide, Millie. Contamination removal is a pretty important part of this. This is probably the biggest thing, and I've highlighted down there what I felt was a really important last two sentences on this, is that we can consider post-remediation evaluation when contamination of unrestorable contaminated items and debris have been removed and surfaces are visibly clean. And we're going to get into confirmation of cleanliness later on, and Gavin's going to cover that. But the bottom line here is before we do anything, before we can even consider ourselves near complete, it has to be visibly clean. And it's clean and free of odors. And that's another thing that's going to be important. We'll talk about that in the odor section as well. We can move on to the next slide. So confidentiality, and I'm going to let Scott. This is something that is this confidentiality has been an issue, something we've talked about from the very beginning in the original standard, the 2017 version. And I'm going to let Scott address this just a little bit because I think he's got some important points to share with us.
Thank you, David, again. So you guys know, with social media, the ability to live stream using TikTok, Instagram, what we've found that the confidentiality of your client needs to be held to the highest standard regarding multiple things. So in this new adapted version of the reversion of the S540, we put that photos and videos of this nature should not be distributed in any public fashion, such as social media, advertising, or other marketing materials. Okay. What we've been seeing is a lot of people are live streaming and showing what they're doing. They use it as educational aspects, but realistically, it's a thing just to get likes. And this is something that we've decided that for the privacy of our clientele and what we're dealing with, we had to put this into the standard. There is a couple lawsuits that are currently going on that actually relate to this. So as a census body, we thought it was extremely important to put this into a standard because of the confidentiality of those persons who've been deceased or the family members that are going through a traumatic experience right now. So we do not re-victimize these people. That's good, Dave.
So Scott, at this point, let's back up to this for just a second, Millie. I want to point out something very important here. There are trigger words within all of the standards that are common. If you see the word shall, it's a law. Non-negotiable, you got to do it. And that's, especially when we get into safety stuff, that's a shall. When you see the word should, that is required within the standard. Now, there's no law on this confidentiality thing. But if you violate this, your company could be held civilly liable. You could be sued because you didn't meet the minimum requirements within the standard to maintain the confidentiality of your customer. When you see the word recommend, it's a good idea and very, very important, but it's less of a liability issue here. There is provisions for training, and there is important things here on this confidentiality. Just to bring out a couple of points. It's important that you document what's doing. So if there's insurance coverage on it, you have proof of loss and you'll be able to get that coverage. Be real careful when you're sharing that information with an insurance adjuster, because very often the insurance adjusters work in a team. We've had situations occur where, yeah, send the pictures over, we're ready for it, but the other team member wasn't, and they were really surprised when they opened up the pictures. It's also possible for you to use these photographs within your own trainings, maintaining confidentiality, but it's not something to be broadcasted out in public media as a marketing event. And we don't want to sensationalize that. So I just wanted to point out that the term should as being an important part of the standard and is required. And the word shall obviously is law. So Millie, we can move on.
Thank you. And I
David.
think, Scott, you had a
Yeah,
comment.
David, if you don't mind, it's also what David just said. It's recommended that companies have a written policy for this as well. Something that happens is how the person or your employee is taking the pictures. And this is something that you should have in a written policy. Can they use the pictures? Should they be using the pictures? Are they the property of your company, or are they the property of the individual taking the pictures? So it's also always very recommended that you have a policy written for this regarding any type of scene, any type of picture taking that you physically go on to a job and take these pictures.
And Scott, to piggyback on that, as our conversation that we've had, it's probably a good idea for the company to provide a standalone camera for this purpose and disable the geopositioning feature within that photograph, as opposed to taking photos on a person's cell phone or even a company cell phone. That would probably make this a little bit easier to manage.
Exactly. There's a lot of programs that allow us with apps that let us handle this type of work, so it's not on an employee's phone.
Important point there. Okay, Millie, let's move on. So one of the things that was a change within the standard, the 2017 version defined porous type 1 and porous type 2 material, contents. And there was kind of an assumption that that would carry over to structural items. The 2023 version formalized that. So you'll see porous type 1 and porous type 2 in both structural material and content items. And just for a quick definition here, porous type 1 is any material that can be immersed in a water-based cleaning solution. So if you can put it in a washing machine or a big tub or something, that's a porous type 1 material. Porous type 2 material are other material that you can't immerse. And in very simple formats, so when you get a porous type 1 material with blood saturation, you're gonna be removing that, where porous type 1 material is possibly restorable. And then we've defined semi-porous and non-porous material, pretty straightforward on that. Not a whole lot of changes, except it was just brought over into the structural side and maybe a little more clearly defined than it was in the 2017 version of the standard. And if we could go on to the next slide there. This is a really good important point on structural restoration. We're making a should here to clean materials before they're removed. Now, for the general population, cleaning something that you're going to throw away doesn't make sense. But in our practice here, this is actually an engineering control to minimize potential risks to the technician. So we want to clean the things as much as possible before we remove them. And then if there is some removal that is done on these materials, we're suggesting a minimum of 6 inches past visible contamination on the semi-porous material. And this would be important things like sheetrock and stuff like that, where you may have physical damage, say from a blast or a gunshot or whatever, that you're going to have to remove that material. So that's the point, to get 6 inches beyond the visible contamination when you're removing that material. And then on the structural cleaning, we look at removing unwanted substances from these surfaces. And what I found in my experience here is that those companies who have experience in fire restoration and that detailed type of cleaning tend to have very, very good success in trauma and crime scene cleanup, because they have that kind of meticulous nature built into them. Where we see people that struggle, and I'm not saying that they fail at this, but where they struggle is people who don't have a cleaning background, and they tend to be removing things maybe that could be restored. So I think we have to consider that. So the validation of cleanliness really is visual. Encapsulation and sealing of material, this is something that can be done, but it's not a common practice. It seems to be in the cleaning and restoration industry that people want to clean it and then paint over everything. And there's really not the need to do that if you've done good protocol in your cleaning and you've got a good assessment on it and it's visually clean and you don't have any odors. It's not that the sealing is required, but it can be done, but it's not something that is required. So I just wanted to make a point on that. And then this is a really big topic, especially in our public review, was decomposition odor. And we had a lot of comment on it, where we had people who wanted to go in and just tear the whole building down because it smelled. And, you know, basic comment from a lot of the CB was, boy, we really need to teach people how to clean and deodorize. So the decomposition odor, which we sometimes called delayed discovery, can be very, very uh, obnoxious and a pretty serious odor, but it is removable, and it is permanently removable. And a point to make here is that odor control may require a combination of techniques. So it's not relying on one simple method here. So how we get the odor out very simply is we can ventilate it, we can clean it, we can use HEPA air scrubbers, we can use other deodorizing methods that might be appropriate in certain situations. But the bottom line here is when you get it clean, your odor's going to be gone. It's that pretty straightforward. It's that straightforward. And we just want to point out here that it may not be necessary to remove porous material just because it has an odor in it. It can be cleaned and deodorized.
And a good point there, David. You've mentioned those trigger words, shall and should. There's a trigger word in this section, shall. Again, it means it's mandatory, but you shall comply with the customer right to know laws. You shall follow personal protective equipment that is, for the chemicals you use as well as the equipment you use.
And Gavin, that's an excellent point, especially when you're dealing with something like ozone. It's a tool that can be used, certainly, but obviously not in an occupied space. And people really need to have some knowledge of the different deodorizing techniques for it to be effective. And there is a number of options available that work exceptionally well. And in addition to things like ozone and hydroxyls, you've got oxidizing agents that would include chlorine dioxide and other oxidizers as well. But again, if you're getting into this business, it would really probably be worth your time to take the odor control class as a supplement to this. Really would recommend that. So Melody, we can go forward. We're going to get into post-remediation evaluation, and Gavin, I'd like you to kind of take off on this section and explain to the attendees here what we're trying to get across.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. I want to start with, for trauma and crime scene cleanup, a person needs knowledge, skills, and also there's a lot to do here with behavior. And I know David, Scotty, and we're involved in training and education. Behavior is a key to being successful in trauma and crime scene cleanup. You will work with hazards, you'll have risk. There are things that can go wrong that will have consequences. And when you think about consequences, you need to think about how bad can it get. And again, some of these hazards and risks are very similar for many jobs that you'll do. Now, here in section 8, we're on page 55 with post-remediation. There is another standard trigger word here, should. And the statement was, should for post-remediation evaluation by technicians, as well as post-remediation verification by an independent indoor environmental professional party, you've got to keep documentation of the criteria and processes. The minimum performance requirements. And it's really important that we talk about someone outside our company as an independent, for example. But if we don't have access to an independent, or we don't bring an independent onto the job, then using that word should disclose, should disclose the relationship in writing to the client. Transparency here is so important.
And Gavin, if I might interject here, is it's really a common thing when we're dealing with mold remediation. In fact, it's law in many states that the person that is doing the inspection, if it's a laboratory type inspection and pulling samples, is separate and apart, has no conflict of interest with the company. So it's the company is not pulling the samples, but the independent evaluator is.
Yeah, exactly. Next slide, please. So David talked about the fact that this standard, the S540, has a section on demobilization. It's on page 55. The standard says that demobilization starts not just at the end, but also at the beginning of the project, where you should have an inventory. And then at the end of the project, upon completion of the project, you should have an exit inventory of all the tools, equipment, products that have been taken into the building, into the scene of where you're cleaning up. So it's very important to understand from this aspect of how to prevent, for example, cross-contamination and potential accidental exposures. And I think this is a real critical part of what the consensus body brought to the S540 revision, was this demobilization section.
And Gavin, to add to that, if you have a good plan, that means you're efficient, which means you're more profitable. So now we probably got everybody's attention.
And
Next.
Gavin, one of the key points of this is the zones separation. And when we talk about zones, it doesn't mean it has to be a physical barrier. And a lot of people do not understand that. In certain cases, you can just make the areas and just designate them in that area without putting a physical barrier. And just, it could be imaginary, saying this, we do not cross this line. And a lot of people always think it just has to be a physical barrier, or it needs to be a physical barrier, but it doesn't necessarily. It just needs to separate the areas in zones. And if you can do that, you can reduce the risk of cross-contamination.
Okay, let's move on here. We've got a timeline that we've got to get to.
This is section 10, cleaning contents. I just want to emphasize here that the goal is to clean items by physically removing contamination. That's the definition of cleaning anyway. But the fact here is that, you know, we want to ensure that the items are safe, sanitary, and usable. And there is one confusion that again is addressed in the standard. It does not necessarily mean that an item has been improved in appearance. And again, you'll often see the conversations, dialogue between the client and the worker or the company. Or I expected it to be better than it was before the event actually happened. So that's not what the standard mentions. Next slide, please. All of section 12 starts on page 69, is about confirmation of cleaning. We've got another trigger word here. We're going to use should, again, as our component of accepted standard of care. You need to understand the history of the event, should be considered, establishing what the event was to be cleaned and inspected. Also blood, body fluids, that's anything that's wet that comes from the body. And you'll also see in the standard the acronym OPIM, which stands for other potentially infectious material. All of this can spread beyond the immediate area of the incident. And so there are methods of quality assurance that includes methods of assessing cleaning practices and methods for assessing the level of cleanliness. Again, in section 12, services should be cleaned, tested, recleaned until acceptable results have been achieved. And we recommend that all results are recorded, again, more documentation. And then further on, we're going to talk now within section 12, some of those confirmation techniques. This is section 12.2 on page 69. A lot of the tools and techniques that are in the S540 standard have actually come from other industries. They're based on science and evidence. To use them requires education and training, but it's doable. And it's important that you understand that. That technicians that use these tools and techniques, they use them in a way that they're designed to be used. They understand their limitations of any of the testing methods that you use for confirmation. Next slide, please. Hydrogen peroxide, section 12.2.1 on page 69, talks about hydrogen peroxide being used as an indicator of residual blood and other potentially infectious material, because you'll see foaming. Not always, but in most cases, you'll see that when you put hydrogen peroxide on a surface where there's blood or other potentially infectious material, you'll get foaming. And again, within the standard lists the advantages and disadvantages of hydrogen peroxide. Next slide. There's the advantages, next slide, and the disadvantages of hydrogen peroxide. Next slide. Ultraviolet light or black light Many of you may be familiar with ultraviolet light, black light. You need to learn and understand when and how it can be used. What fluoresces, what doesn't. The standard also lists, again, the advantages and disadvantages. And it's important to note, if I can go to the next slide, please. It's important to note that blood stains, or blood itself, does not fluoresce, and it'll often appear black. So again, crime, trauma scenes, we do get fluids, body fluids, as well as blood that we have to clean and remediate. It's important to understand that UV light does not fluoresce off blood stains. Next slide, please. So again, a lot of the work that we do, cleaning, restoration, remediation, relies on visual assessments. Very important to understand this is subjective. And what I mean by that, it's based on an individual's determination. So today you've got Scott, you've got Millie, you've got David, you've got myself on here. We could all look at the same surface and come up with a different answer based on our subjectivity, our opinions. So it's important that that we understand that is a limitation, visual assessment, but there are other things you could do. For example, you could use a gloved hand, like a white glove. I think the 12 years I had in the military, I did a lot of white gloved assessments. And again, there are other ways that you can look at, maybe a white cloth for those types of assessments. But important, we've also listed in the standard the advantages and the disadvantages. Next slide, please. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. It indicates there's organic material, microbial, biologic. It's important to understand that ATP is a tool, a technique that has come from other industries into our industry, and it's something that, again, we can use. It provides a number for before and after cleaning. It can be used to determine the effectiveness of a cleaning procedure, and it also can be used to indicate the level of cleanliness. It requires training, but it's very straightforward training. But the key to using an ATP meter, taking those swabs, is to understand how to take swab samples that are meaningful from the surface that you're testing. And again, in the standard, it lists the advantages and disadvantages for using ATP meters. Disadvantages on this slide, advantages on the other side. So next slide, please. Environmental cultures. And throughout my career, chasing biological weapons, responding to outbreaks of disease of high consequence, environmental cultures has always been a part of the work that I did on a daily basis. We are now seeing more environmental cultures, whether it be swabs or maybe a contact agar plate being used throughout the industry when it comes to trauma and crime scene cleanup. It does require access to laboratory resources. It does require access to trained personnel for interpreting the results. And it can identify the presence of specific pathogens such as bacteria. So it's important that if you're serious about being in the industry, you're using the IICRC S540 standard, and you haven't even developed yet, or haven't thought about how to develop those relationships with laboratory resources. I think the standard actually states that that's something that you should be thinking about, you should be doing, and it actually is part of the work that we do on a daily basis, depending on the circumstances of that event. Next slide. So I just wanted to end with section 12 was all those confirmation techniques. There are other tools and techniques available. There's even more that are becoming available right now. There's more that are being used by other industry sectors that are now becoming available commercially for the work that we do, such as real-time PCR and more devices using a combination of UV lights. So again, you'll see these available. There's a lot of experts that are associated with the IICRC that can provide assistance and help in understanding what the standard talks about in confirmation techniques, and also some of the other ones that may not be in the standard, but you may want to learn about, then feel free to reach out to IICRC.
And Gavin, just to clarify on this too, that in most cases, and in the high majority of the trauma and crime scene cleanup projects that we work on, it's that visual and the olfactory, the odor, that's going to be the determination of whether we're done or not. And these other options are very, very important to consider when we've got other risks that are involved and other concerns. And one thing we didn't touch on that I think we need to be aware of as part of our safety program is that if we're in a high crime area and there's the presence of illicit drugs, this really adds a pretty serious concern, especially when we get into some contamination with fentanyl and stuff like that on top of the trauma and crime scene cleanup. So it could be more than just what appears to be the problem. So with that, I think we turn this over to questions and answers. I think Millie, I think you've got a handle on that for us.
And that's important though, David, because what you can't see can hurt you.
Can't hurt you, could kill you.
Exactly. And David, that's why everyone in this industry should be really looking forward to the S900, because they've done a great job on addressing that. So once the S900 does come out, I think everybody in this industry should be jumping onto that standard and getting that training as well down the line, due to our exposure to illicit drugs.
High risk, even if you're not in this business, for sure. All right, Millie, take it away.
Yeah, and actually I'm going to hand it to Gavin, but I just want to mention for anyone who's wondering, what is the S900 standard? It is a standard that is currently in development. It is the S900 standard for professional remediation of precursors, drug residues, and associated chemical waste. So just wanted to put that out there. And Gavin, handing it to you.
Hi. Thank you, David. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Dr. Gavin. Appreciate you guys for taking time out of your day to go over this with us. I'm only seeing one question in the Q&A right now from Jordan Frady. He says, could you recommend any of these apps or programs to help get away from employees taking photos with their personal phones?
I can answer that. I can't recommend, but what I can say is currently out in the market, you have programs like Company Cam, you also have Encircle, and you do have other programs. That's the only two off the top of my head that I can think of right now because they're more popular. However, I would do the research, but those two are the ones that, again, jump off to the top of my head, David, unless you have something.
No, the only thing that I would suggest is what I did in my business is we had a dedicated camera, geopositioning was shut off, and we did it the old-fashioned way. You brought it back to the office and we downloaded the data into a secure file. And that's how we handled it. So we did not transmit this stuff electronically unless it was to an insurance adjuster.
And one of the things I can mention to that real quick is also having insurance for if your computers are hacked, especially if you do have pictures. Depending on the job you do and the sensitivity, is that make sure that you do have an insurance policy in place within your company that protects you from that.
Point.
And that's an important point, Scotty. One of the other points, I talked about a person needs knowledge, skills, and behavior. You're working in such unique, high stress, high risk environments when it comes to trauma and crime scene. So many people want to show the before and after photos of what they've accomplished. But it's also a way of controlling the trauma or the mental toughness that we have to show when it comes to clean these areas. And unfortunately, a lot of the social media platforms has made it very easy to share those photos. It's challenging that again, a lot of us talk amongst ourselves that when we've been into a really tough situation, we do share what we've done, mainly to reinforce that we know what we're doing. We've followed the science, we've followed the evidence. So again, we can't get away from people not taking photos. We just got to be better managers of those photos.
Right. And Bob Shipyor just wanted to say thank you for your time and very informative. So thanks again. And then Jordan has a follow-up question. He says, for companies who primarily handle small residential and apartment trauma jobs, how do we feasibly incorporate something like a third-party IEP, time and financially? Is this something being used at every job?
Well, I'll start by saying that it's not commonly done on every job. But what I think Gavin will address this is to make the relationship with a company or several companies that can do this work. So basically what you're going to have to do is some groundwork to find out the people, and typically these would be people like industrial hygienists that would do this type of thing. But you need to find out the skill set of that company, because some of them don't have the background in bioremediation or trauma and crime scene cleanup. And so you want to develop that relationship with them before the need occurs. And so Gavin, can you expand on that?
Yeah, it's a lot what we deal with the emergency management community, the disaster response community. We've got the trauma and crime scene community. It's important before the events, David, to make relationships. Make relationships with the first responders, make relationships with the resources such as laboratory resources for diagnostics. And again, it depends on the event, the size of the event, who's involved in the event, on whether that third party it may be required. So again, if you're in the game, you're doing what you're doing right now, and you haven't started making relationships with the first responders, with the resources that we do have within our communities to help us with the work that we do, then you really should reach out to them and introduce yourselves and tell them what you do. Again, it takes a team to clean up any trauma and crime scene event.
Gavin and David, one of the things that we have to look at, which isn't, and the importance of CIHs is you also have to look at lead, you have to look at asbestos, you have to look at other things that could be incorporated into our scenes. So it's always better that we talk about, when we talk about the S540, we talk about risk assessments. Risk assessments should be done prior to any job that we're starting. So with that, you're going to now look at certain things that might require an IEP or a second person so you can contact them right away. For example, an asbestos project manager, if asbestos is a possibility. So all of them things should be established with your risk assessment before you start a job. And then when you start that job, that's when you're going to be able to bring somebody in. But not every single job requires it. However, that will be determined by a risk assessment starting the job.
And section 4 of the S540 standard on page 31 actually does cover those administrative procedures, project documentation, and risk management.
And Scott, to further elaborate on that, when you said required, this is not just something that the standard is requiring, this is by law. So you're dealing with hazardous material that requires a federal or state licensed person to be able to do that inspection. Just to share with the people here, in my company, we in writing on our work authorization recommended to the customer that if they needed verification of cleanliness, they would hire a qualified certified industrial hygienist to do the clearance testing on that. We did have a number of companies that we worked with, and if they said, who do we call, we could recommend 2 or 3 different people for them to call. I'll be honest with you, we never did on any of the trauma and crime scene that we processed, did we ever have somebody come in and test it. We also were not involved in anything that was extremely high risk. We didn't have any trauma and crime scenes, say in a daycare or a school, where the level of concern would be much higher. So just some thoughts there for you.
Not seeing any other open questions at this time, but thank you all for attending this month's webinar. Actually, Jordan just hit me with another question here. He says, are there more resources that can help with sections 2.1.3 regarding biocontaminated ACMs, and who handles and disposes of these materials? We have seen companies just handle the ACM as biomaterial and the opposite.
All right, well, I'll address that question. The standard is a should. All right, and when you have asbestos, that's a shall. So the asbestos laws trump or override or take the precedence over the standard. Now, to be honest with you, if you're handling asbestos properly, you're probably not going to have a problem with biological material. But we have to look at it in terms of what is the law. There is a law for asbestos. There is a law for lead. There is a law for PCBs. There's a law for these regulated materials. There are a very few laws, as Scott has pointed out, that deal specifically with trauma and crime scene cleanup. And again, as a reminder on those laws basically are safety, transportation, disposal, and storage. And then in those states that Scott brought out where there is licensing required.
Excellent. And Jordan, just wanted to follow up and say I appreciate all your time and effort put into these standards and hosting this webinar. Great information that was very much appreciated.
David, could I alliterate something on that? Is
Sure.
regarding ACM, I've spoken about this, is talk to your local and state DEP or your environmental conservative people. The reason is who's going to be handling that could depend on your state regulations. For example, in New Jersey, which I can speak of on behalf of my company, is we're allowed to remove ACM if it's contaminated with blood. However, we cannot remove it if it is not. So the standard said 6 inches. In New Jersey, we can go up to a foot and remove any blood contaminated in ACM without a license. However, like I said, this is New Jersey only, and I reached out to get that certification in writing. So if you are going to be doing that, or you think that's a possibility, reach out to your state and see what they would like, and just keep at that until you get an answer, and make sure you get that in writing. But then make sure you always follow the federal regulations regarding OSHA. If you're removing any type of ACM or any type of lead, make sure that the training and everything is accordance to that federal law.
Right.
Thank you,
That
Scott.
definitely would kick in the BASWAPR course at that point, with no doubt. So Scott, I'm going to let you say a quick thank you to everybody here, and then we'll go to Gavin to close this up.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Any questions? We're always open. Just reach out to all of us or any of us if you have any questions, and I thank you for attending.
And Gavin, any closing words?
If you're in the business, you're in the game, I would highly recommend volunteering to be on a consensus body for a standard at IICRC. I had post-traumatic stress after we lost our Tuesday nights, David. I really enjoyed our Tuesday night sessions for 2.5 years. And again, the amount of what we've learned from each other, but just the group that we had was just so fantastic to work with. So highly recommended, volunteer for IICRC.
You'll learn a lot, and you'll make a lot of really great friends. It is a free education that you're going to pay with by time and commitment. And with that, Millie, you can close us out.
Wow, thank you. Thanks to everyone for your time. We have recorded this session and it will be made available shortly. I just want to say a big thank you to our speakers today, David Oakes, Dr. Gavin McGregor, and Scott Vogel. Lots of great information. A big thank you.
All right, and that will conclude this month's webinar. Now, for all of our certified firm attendees, this recording will be added to the toolbox within your firm profile. Give us 72 business hours, should be up by next Wednesday. And then that will be the case as well for the continuing education credit as well for your attendance. So be on the lookout for that. It should be coming no later than Thursday of next week. And that will conclude this webinar. Have a great rest of your day, everybody.